Greetings, welcome to the show. Today we're going to take a look at this things in relation to Africa and Europe and the contrasting future when it comes to certain aspects of these societies. So basically I'll be looking at the immigration or migration issue and the economics of both Europe and Africa over the next 20 or 30 years. What we know is that certain areas of Europe's demographics are likely to decline in the next 20 or 30 years, up to around 2050. So according to certain statistics, I have one here from the certain organization, the Center for Global Development, has statistics that the working age people in Europe is likely to decline, and I have some figures for 3 countries plus the European Union as a whole. The United Kingdom is set to decline by 3.6 million by 2050. France, it will decline by 3.9. Germany, 7 million, and the European Union as a whole, around 43.7 million workers will be lost by the year 2050. So looking at that information, you get the impression now that one of the reasons for the promotion of migration into Europe is to fill that workers' gap. And one of the other issues I'll be looking at is what's happening with the African continent by the year 2050 in terms of free trade and this African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was signed, I think it was 2018 or 2019. So according to the Brookings Institute, this free trade agreement is forecast to boost intra-African trade by as much as 52%, according to a widely cited study. And to boost the economies by 450 billion by 2035. There's a higher figure which I'll mention later on, but this one is stating 450 billion by 2035. There's another figure which I'll mention by 2050. It's quite a bit higher than that. So these are the issues that I'll be looking at. But first I'm going to look at this issue of migrations out of Africa and West Asia, especially since around 2014, 2015, after the EU and NATO bombed Libya and they killed Gaddafi basically and disorganized Libya. You find that Libya was one of the main pathways going into Europe, which was, I wouldn't say stifled. Gaddafi had some control over the migration through that region. So when he died and when Libya became destabilized, you find a great increase in the number of migrants passing through that area of the continent. But currently Africa has issues with that, and also when I said NATO bombed Libya, this is one of the issues in regards to the causation of increase in migrations from Africa and West Asia, looking at countries like Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq. I'll give you some examples of what has been said by leaders of certain countries in the region and their perception of Western interference in the areas. This was around 2022 or earlier. The Nigerian Foreign Minister Yusuf Tugar said that his country had been deeply concerned about the escalation of the spread of weapons in the Sahel region, something that had occurred with the collapse of the Libyan state. So even Nigeria was concerned about what was happening in the region because of the destabilization that came from the invasion of Libya. And the Sahel region, I'll detail the countries in the Sahel region. You have Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, Sudan, and Eritrea. Those are the main countries. It also mentions Cameroon and Central African Republic. So the Sahel region stretches from West Africa right through to the east, but the main countries of concern here, I think, are Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, mainly focused in the west in terms of the disturbances coming from these Islamist militants and these so-called versions of ISIS that spread from West Asia into Africa. And another complaint came from, well, this one is more an accusation coming from Mali about the interference in the Malian country itself. Mali says France has violated its airspace and delivered arms to Islamist militants in an attempt to destabilize the West African country. The latest in a barrage of accusations that have marked the bitter end to their once close relations. In a letter to the head of the United Nations Security Council, dated Monday, Mali's Foreign Affairs Minister Abdoulaye Diop said its airspace had been breached more than 50 times this year, mostly by French forces using drones, military helicopters and fighters. So Mali is also complaining about the fact that France is arming these Islamist militants, the same Islamist militants who they're claiming to be fighting against. You'll find that they're supplying the arms to. And if we go across to West Asia, here the supreme leader of Iran blames the United States for the instability in the Middle East and said Washington's fight against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant was a lie, basically saying it's a deception. They're using this war mainly as a method to destabilize the region, but they were claiming that they were fighting against these so-called terrorists, but they were spurring them on, basically, and helping them to create this destabilization. And again, this is the Fars news agency, Iranian newspaper. Captured ISIS leaders in Iraq confessed to receiving military and intelligence support from the United States. As the ISIL commanders captured in Iraq popular forces, recent military operations have confessed the U.S. supports for the terrorist groups are not limited to the dispatch of logistical support. He reiterated that the U.S. has provided the ISIL with intelligence about the Iraqi forces' positions and targets. So the U.S. is basically helping the terrorists to harass the Iraqi military. So those are some of the things going on with, in terms of destabilizing. One of the strategies of the West, particularly the U.S., in the strive to maintain its dominance in the world. One is economic, as we know, with things like sanctions, but also if you keep certain regions of the world destabilized, or make sure they have some element of instability, they're unable to settle down and start developing their societies properly. So those are some of the, one of the causes of instability. Another one is it goes back further to the colonial process, when during the colonial period, the Europeans used certain strategies to keep global South countries underdeveloped. For example, in West Africa in particular, their textile industry was undermined by the British, in terms of the British bringing in much cheaper manufactured goods from their cheaply manufactured goods. The cotton going into their manufactured goods came from the slave plantations in America, and this as a almost free resource was enabled them to make cheap products which they then sent onto or sold onto Africa and India as well. India is another market which they destabilized and broke down their own textile industry so that the British could send in their own textiles. In West Africa in particular, the local artisans that made fabrics couldn't compete with the cheap materials coming in from the UK. And in the current day, you have what they call neo-colonial practices. Aid was, or still is to a certain extent, a practice of supposedly assisting African countries in particular ways. And this undermines a country's capacity to seek its own solutions if the Western powers keep sending in their people to so-called assist countries to tackle their own issues.
Foreign donors, whatever aid and donation they offer to developing nations, they don't do it with a mere sense of charity or altruism. Rather, they use it as a tool to dictate their social, economic, and political direction to these nations that they should take. Understanding such Western world's anti-development effort to developing nations, many scholars are repeatedly calling on leaders of third world countries to come up with some counter strategies.
Then you have the issue of loans. Loans, as I think a lot of people know, come at certain expenses and will come with certain conditions, such as, particularly IMF loans. It will come with a loan, but you have to make certain changes to your country's budget in order to be able to pay back that loan. And this means cuts to certain sectors, such as the health sector, and maybe even things like education. Basically, the budget for the country becomes disorganized because you have to meet the debts that these people have created. And in terms of trade, even this recent trade deal between the EU and Africa has certain restrictions on the quality of goods. When you put certain stringent guidelines on the goods, the quality of the goods that a country can import into your country, it's more like a restriction, trade restriction on their goods, when the quality of goods that you demand are very difficult for them to meet. So those are some of the more recent restrictive practices in which the West used to hamper the economic growth of African countries or global South countries. Although these practices are currently going on, the recent agreement signed, this African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is promising to bring a certain amount of growth and development to African economies. And one of the factors is mentioned is that it could also be an increase of exports, manufactured exports to Europe, something which Europe may not be able to prevent with its own economy set to decline. And this is in relation to their demographic issues. So let's have a look at some of the reports that I've mentioned. These developments. This is by GIS Reports. GIS Reports is what you call Geopolitical Intelligence Services. They have a website with some of their articles and reports on certain political issues and economic issues. So here it's saying that at the same time, an increase in intra-regional and inter-regional trade has the potential to accelerate export-led growth and expand economic opportunities across Africa, especially after the enactment of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or Free Trade Area. Again, while many of the reasons behind Africa's poor trade performance can only be addressed by African countries, Europe could play a prominent role as the largest market for African exports during a period characterized by regionalization rather than globalization. So here they're indicating that as Africa's economy or manufacturing base increases, the European Union could be one of the targets for their manufactured exports. And here, this one is an interesting line of thinking. There's a certain gentleman from around the 1920s, they say that he's the godfather of the European Union. His name is Khaldun Kalergi, and he formed one of the first versions of the European Union, or a pan-European Union. So he's seen as the godfather of the current European Union. But he also wrote a lot of documents and books about what he foresaw as a future Europe and how Europe is likely to play out in terms of its relations with the global south. So here he's saying we shall wake to find ourselves elbowed and hustled and perhaps even thrust aside by peoples whom we looked down upon as servile and thought of as bound always to minister to our needs. So people they once thought they could be superior to forever almost will one day push them aside and be strong economically to the extent that they can bypass the European Union economically, to the extent that the European will become dependent. Well, they're dependent on resources at the moment, but in terms of manufactured goods, they'll also become dependent. This is also a similar quote from him. The day will come, and perhaps is not far distant, when the European observer will look around to see the globe girdled with continuous zone of the black and yellow races, no longer too weak for aggression or under tutelage, but independent or practically so in government, monopolizing the trade of their own regions and circumscribing the industry of the European. So circumscribing the industry of the European, that means that they'll bypass, they'll no longer need the European industries as they'll develop their own. Well, China has already done that, India to some degree, but Africa is set to be the next place that bypasses the European industrial sector, even to the extent of exporting to the European Union. But the European Union is losing, as I mentioned earlier, they're losing their working age population. That's one of the reasons why I think they're even set to try and increase the number of migrants going into their region. But as the African economy itself develops, this may not be an option, as if the continental economy develops and Africans no longer need to travel to Europe, it's something that I think that will worry them in the future. So those are two of the main issues around the migration and economic issue. The fact that Europe is going to lose its working age population over a period of time, and then Africa's economies are set to increase to a greater range, but it all depends on how Africa handles this process of unifying how it handles the free trade protocols and how trade actually develops. At the moment, Africa's countries mainly manufacture similar goods and export similar primary goods. That's resources and crops, basically. If these can be diversified, then more trade can take place within the continent. That's a basic look at some of the things happening, or some of the what you could call thoughts, or things that have been said about Africa's future, and some of the reports that have been written projecting an economic growth of the continent due to this African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I think that's it for now.